Dr. Janet Davey, a forensic Egyptologist based in Melbourne, claims to have dispelled what she calls an urban myth by demonstrating that certain mummified Egyptian children with fair hair were, in fact, naturally blonde, rather than having their hair artificially lightened during the embalming process. While many Egyptologists have long assumed that blonde or red hues seen in mummy hair result from the chemical effects of natron, Dr. Davey contends that her experiment proves otherwise. Working with retired industrial chemist Alan Elliott, Dr. Davey reproduced synthetic natron, the preservative salt used in ancient embalming, and exposed 16 modern hair samples to the substance for 40 days, mirroring ancient Egyptians' practice of desiccating bodies over the same length of time. The samples, which ranged in color from dark to gray, with one fair specimen, came from donors aged 4 to 92 and included some treated with henna, a dye used historically by Egyptian embalmers, such as those who worked on Ramesses II. After the 40-day exposure, none of the hair samples had lightened in color. Convinced by these findings, Dr. Davey asserts that the fair-haired child mummies must have been born blonde rather than having undergone post-mortem discoloration. We would like to point out a critical missteps in this study. First of all, a 40-day exposure to synthetic natron in controlled laboratory conditions cannot capture all of the variables in ancient Egyptian mummification. Oils, resins, climate factors, and centuries of burial may have produced effects on hair color that extend beyond what Dr. Davey's modern setup could replicate. Dr. Davey emphasizes the Greco-Roman period, which indeed introduced new genetic variations into Egypt. However, this era represents only a fraction of Egyptian history and does not account for the cultural and genetic continuum extending from the pre-dynastic to the late period. The claim that a few blonde individuals appeared during a specific time frame does not, by itself, explain or redefine the overall population's heritage. In this presentation, we will examine the long-standing debate concerning the ancestry of the ancient Egyptians. Since the UNESCO Symposium of 1974, it has been widely accepted that the Egyptians were Black Africans, and that they stand as both direct and indirect ancestors of present-day Africans and African descendants across the Americas. However, a puzzling question arises. How do we reconcile this conclusion with mummified remains that feature straight, blonde to reddish hair? We will demonstrate that these findings, rather than contradicting the African heritage of ancient Egypt, point to specific mummification methods and hair treatments that took place after death. Renowned Egyptologist Eugen Strohal's investigation into the early presence of Black African populations in pre-dynastic Egypt presents a wealth of evidence, especially hair characteristics among them, that confirms a substantial African presence in the earliest settled communities of Upper Egypt. Strohal's study encompassed 117 skulls from the Badarian period. In several of these burials, hair had been preserved by the arid desert sands, revealing a mixture of curly, wavy, and occasionally straight forms in various shades of black, brown, and gray. Most notably, microscopic analyses by S. Titlbashova identified a significant flattening of the hair shafts in 5 out of 7 curly or wavy samples, a feature widely associated with so-called sub-Saharan African or Negroid ancestry. The frequent appearance of curly, flattened cross-section hair underlines the decisive influence of African genes among the Badarians, dating back to approximately 4000 BCE. By demonstrating that these traits were widespread in one of the earliest agricultural societies in the Nile Valley, Strohal's work points to a deeply rooted African lineage shaping the biological and cultural foundations of ancient Egyptian civilization from its very beginnings. Let's go through additional evidence. 2 notable examples are the mummies of Priest Yuya and Priestess Tuya. Both exhibit features commonly associated with Black Africans, such as full lips and pronounced prognathism. Genetic studies confirm that they are closely related to populations in sub-Saharan Africa. This supports the argument that their origins are undeniably African. Nevertheless, their mummified remains show hair that appears smooth and light in color. Equally noteworthy are the remains of Ramses II. Contrary to popular iconography that depicts him with clearly African hair texture, the mummy attributed to Ramses II has been presented with straight, lighter hair, seemingly contradicting accounts like that of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who described Egyptians as having black skin and frizzy hair. Previous studies considered that these might have been black individuals with naturally looser curls, similar to those found in some Somali or Indian communities, but the volume of mummies displaying straight hair suggests a deeper explanation. The discrepancy becomes clearer through an understanding of the mummification process. The Egyptians practiced a systematic procedure: washing the body. The deceased was cleansed using a combination of palm wine and water. Organ removal. Internal organs: brain, intestines, stomach, lungs, and liver were removed, leaving only the heart. Desiccation with natron. The body was then covered in natron, a type of salt, for 40 days to eliminate moisture. Embellishment. After desiccation, fragrant oils, frankincense, and myrrh were applied. To restore volume, sawdust and sand were used. Wrapping. Finally, the remains were wrapped in strips of cloth. Central to these steps is natron, an alkaline preservative critical for desiccation. Natron's alkalinity, pH above 7, is comparable to that of Lake Magadi in Tanzania, whose highly alkaline waters, around pH 11.5, naturally mummify animal carcasses. Critically, alkaline solutions have a chemical effect on hair. In fact, caustic soda, another alkaline substance with a pH between 12 and 14, laid the groundwork for modern hair straightening techniques. It is worth noting that enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade sometimes suffered punishments where their heads were immersed in lye, caustic soda, in water. Aside from causing burns, this process was observed to straighten the hair. Over time, this practice evolved into the basis for commercially available hair relaxers, which function primarily through the strong alkalinity of their active ingredients. Mummification with natron, however, went far beyond mere minutes of contact. It lasted 40 days. Thus, it is not surprising that the hair of an individual, known to be curly or kinky in life, might appear smooth in death. Another essential consideration is hair color. Henna has been used in Africa since the Pharaonic era to dye both skin and hair. Ancient images frequently depict figures with a red tint in their hair, consistent with the known application of henna. In the specific case of Ramses II, who is said to have reached advanced age before his death, his mummy's lighter hair color is consistent with dyes applied post-mortem. In 1886, the French scholar Maspero reported that Ramses II's hair likely received treatment producing its light tone, while his eyebrows and remaining facial hair remained naturally white. Additionally, Maspero noted that Ramses II's lips were thick, again suggesting an African phenotype. This application of henna would have provided the red or blonde hue, while sodium bicarbonate, chemically akin to natron, can further lighten hair. Consider Pharaoh Ahmose. Illustrations from his reign show him wearing locks, yet his mummy, by contrast, exhibits straight hair. Given the high alkalinity and prolonged application of natron, as well as potential hair dyeing practices, it becomes apparent that mummification could produce such transformations. Thus, the presence of straight, lighter hair on mummified remains does not contradict the indisputable African identity of these ancient rulers and their people. On the contrary, it reflects standard mummification treatments. Moreover, some mummies have been found with frizzy hair intact, implying that different preservation methods or chronological variations may account for discrepancies in how the hair was affected. These findings reinforce the idea that ancient Kemet, commonly known as Egypt, was both culturally and biologically African. Mummies like Prince Maihapri, likely the son of Thutmose IV and therefore uncle to Pharaoh Akhenaten, serve as powerful reminders of the deep African lineage at the heart of the Nile Valley civilization. Such evidence connects modern Africans and the African diaspora to a legacy of advanced science, art, and statecraft. The seemingly contradictory features of certain mummified remains can be attributed to the chemical processes involved in embalming, including prolonged exposure to highly alkaline natron, and the later application of henna and similar hair treatments. These procedures, rather than casting doubt on the African origin of the ancient Egyptians, instead highlight the sophisticated methods and traditions that shaped one of the world's most remarkable civilizations. Ancient so-called Egyptians, both culturally and physically, shared deep connections with other African societies across the continent. One of the clearest links is found in the discussion of hairstyles. From short twists and locks to elaborate braids, these designs transcend distant regions and span centuries of African history. The short twist is one striking example. It continues to be worn in parts of Africa today. We see it from Kush in the south to Benin in the west, and even among the Afar people in Ethiopia. In Kemet, this style was very popular among men. Countless sculptures and paintings show them wearing tightly coiled twists in neat rows or concentric patterns. Although some Egyptologists suggest these might be wigs inspired by Kushite or Nubian hair, there is no real proof to back that up. Instead, the evidence points to short twists as part of a broad, indigenous African tradition. Indeed, short twist hairstyles can be found in the Horn of Africa, in Western Africa, and across the Nile Valley. Cheikh Anta Diop, in his landmark work, The African Origin of Civilization, highlighted the intimate ties between peoples along the Nile, from northern Egypt all the way south to Kush in modern Sudan. These intertwined cultures shared many customs, not least among them a distinct approach to hair. The widespread nature of short twists is even reflected in the famous Benin bronzes. These bronzes, created in present-day Nigeria, depict kings, warriors, and attendants, many of whom wear close coiled twists that mirror those seen in Kemet. This suggests a continent-wide African aesthetic, rather than isolated or borrowed ideas. Among the Afar men in Ethiopia, this hairstyle can take on more length. Some Afar individuals grow their twists quite long, marking clan identity, community ties, or key life milestones. Whether short or long, the principle remains the same. Likewise, in northeastern Africa, near modern Eritrea and Sudan, travelers and anthropologists have long documented men with short twists. These observations echo what we see in Kemet's art and artifacts, and underscore how widely shared this styling tradition is. Countless ethno-historical records also highlight the importance of hair in African societies. Among the Yoruba and Igbo in Western Africa, twist and braid practices have existed for countless generations. They appear in ceremonies, daily life, and festive rituals. Even ancient Ife and Nok sculptures show hair arrangements that resemble short twists, though styles, of course, vary by region and era. Wall paintings in Kemet give us two-dimensional glimpses of these twists, but it's the statues and bronze busts that bring them to life. Roman-era depictions of Egyptians in museums, such as the British Museum or the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, often show men with tightly coiled twists, framing recognizably African features. Researchers frequently comment on the broad noses, full lips, and forward jawlines that these sculptures display. The presence of short twists on such unmistakably African faces speaks volumes about an enduring tradition of African hairstyling in Kemet. Some Roman artists who lived in Egypt during the imperial period painstakingly captured local hairstyles in their portraits. Instead of forcing a purely Romanized look, they attempted to portray what they actually observed, including the closely coiled, twisted hair on Egyptian men. Despite claims that these short twists might simply be borrowed wigs or passing trends, extensive parallels in African art, culture, and history tell a different story. These were locally rooted hair practices, firmly entrenched in the customs of the Nile Valley and interlinked regions. Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.